All right, my name's Charlie Roberson. This is John Bernot. I know a lot of you folks.
Johnny, use the microphone.
And I know a lot of you know John Bernot. John is owner of Cape Country Dive Shop, and he is a full-time instructor in the area. And sadly enough, he's participated in many of the recoveries that have happened over the last several years. So this is a little more of a somber topic we're going to talk about today. And this is the topic of accident analysis and, or rather the lack thereof that we've had over the last several decades. And I'm going to let John start off here.
All right, guys, we're going to play a little game, if you would. So here's what I'd like you guys to do. Here in a second, I'm going to ask everybody to raise their hand. I'm then going to ask a question. If the answer to that question is yes for you personally, please lower your hand. Good to go? All right, go ahead. Everybody raise their hand real quick. Have you ever done an air dive below 250 feet? Ah, some hands went down.
If I didn't go to
Charlie, you lying?
Maybe.
Have you ever done a visual jump? Ah. Have you ever done a dive outside of your personal certification limits? Have you ever ran a stop sign? All right, so what I'm getting at, guys, is, hey, congratulations. Most of you guys have done those things, and you're still here. So when it comes to accident analysis, just because you break a rule does not necessarily mean the outcome is going to be negative. However, it does mean that the level of risk has just gone up. And unfortunately, in most cases, what we find is that when the actual outcome is negative, it's usually not one thing, but a series of events that led to that negative outcome. So, Sheck Exley, I certainly hope everybody here at least has heard the name and knows who he is. And we kind of consider him one of the fathers of modern cave diving and modern cave instruction. He sat down to look at what the most common direct causes and contributing factors were to the many accidents that he was seeing, specifically in the 70s and early 80s. So when Sheck put these down in writing, he actually originally had 3, and they're up there on the board. Continuous guideline, or lack thereof. Gas planning, and in most cases he was talking about exceeding a certain percentage of gas for penetration purposes. And I think we have to realize too, because this is going to kind of go into what Charlie and I are talking about, times do change. I mean, I've had J-valve cylinders in my dive shops for years, but I never used one. Imagine going into a cave without a pressure gauge. Deep diving, and again, it's not just necessarily narcosis, but at that time too, think about the regulators. Think about the additional stress on those regulators and the work of breathing, diving air at those deeper depths. And then in '84, he added 2 additional ones, training and lights. So here's what we kind of teach as the 5 tenets or golden rules of accident analysis. Training, guideline, air depth, and lights. And I'm going to go into these very briefly here in a second. So training. So I do believe ignorance is an excuse. It's not a good excuse, but it is an excuse. So a diver that legitimately doesn't understand the hazards of what they're about to undertake, it's not necessarily that they're being a cowboy, they don't understand those risks, and so they're ignorant. The problem is that 30, 40 years ago, every open water training organization put in their basic books, maybe not how to cave dive, but don't go into wrecks, don't go into the overhead, don't go into caves. So even a basic open water diver coming out of an open water class has been exposed to that principle. So I find that in most cases, training exists. What we're seeing is in most cases now, people are exceeding their level of training or personal limitations. I think this really goes to what Doug was talking about earlier. Because we don't put on a cave card, you're only allowed to dive to 2,000 feet or 1,500 feet. You're only allowed to dive pre-cave without any silt. You're not allowed to dive high flow. And while a cave diver may be completely comfortable on a certain day in certain conditions, even in the same cave system, if they hit that cave at a different time period, different conditions, that can drastically impact the performance of that diver. And when we talk about the incident pit, little funnel, and the further down into it you get, the harder it is to climb back out when things go wrong. This is very common when we look at these accidents and try to analyze them. Go back one real quick.
Sorry.
So when it comes to trained cave divers, I mean, I hate to say it, I'm not trying to pick on any one diver or one instructor or anything like that, but let's be honest, there are levels of training, there are better classes. Poorly trained divers, they're trained, they have a card, but when things start to spiral and things start to go badly, have they really managed to perfect the skill sets that are going to get them out of that environment? And I don't think it's necessarily just the physical limitations in many cases. I mean, Doug talked a lot about as divers age. Yeah, there's some things there that do change. But there's the mental aspect of it. Is that diver comfortable with silt? Is that diver comfortable with being that far from the door? So the guideline, you know, I think most people think of continuous guideline as simply maintaining a guideline all the way to the exit as far as a primary reel and things like that go. What we're seeing more and more is, it's not that the guideline doesn't exist, it's not that it's being used, but it's not being used properly. And if you break down the fatalities and near misses that we have here in Mexico, what you'll find is that most of the cases that we have here, not all, but most of them, tend to revolve around people going someplace they shouldn't go and medicals. If you look at the accidents in Mexico, over 90% of them have to do with the guideline in terms of navigation. So dropping of cookies and REMs, things like that, I will be honest, I think that people that are trained in Mexico often have a much greater respect for navigation and for the use of those types of tools than people that dive in Florida, where we generally have fewer exits, flow pushing you out, and to be very, completely honest, very, very well-marked caves for the most part. Maintaining continuous guideline and failure too. I mean, visual jumps, that's a classic example of something that is somebody going to have a negative outcome just because they do a visual jump? Well, in Jenny Springs, maybe not. But then that cave diver becomes complacent and he chooses to do something like that in a cave he's not as familiar with, or doesn't recognize that what he thought was someplace he'd been many times before actually wasn't. And then we start to see problems with that. So again, it doesn't mean that the outcome is going to be negative, but when people choose to do things like that, they are increasing the odds of something happening. So when people think of air, I mean, we really need to break down the air piece as far as accident analysis into air as far as gas planning, and then air as far as the gas choices and how those gases and bottles are marked, switched to, and utilized before and during the dive. And I mean, traditionally, we talk about either the rule of 6 or the rule of thirds. Now, a catastrophic gas failure that everybody thinks about, yes, it is possible, and yes, it has happened in the past, but I have a hard time thinking of an accident in the last 20 years where that was a true direct or even contributing cause to the accident itself. What I will say, and I'll throw this out there, when we look at volume, so many people come so close to extracting themselves from a negative scenario. And so when we look at tank volume, a lot of us push the larger tanks here in Florida, and there's reasons for that. They give you more reserve. So that reserve and that thirds or sixths, in my opinion, isn't just about gas for a team member, it's problem-solving gas. It's time that you have to fix a problem and then continue the accident, if that makes sense. So if you're choosing 104s, that's almost twice the amount of time you have to fix a problem as aluminum 80s. Now, aluminum 80s are very popular in many other areas like Mexico because guess what? The caves are shallower overall, not all of them, and overall, you end up with a lot less flow, which decreases exertion, and that means that in most cases the diver does have more time with the same amount of gas to fix the problem itself. But more recently, it's not just about open circuit, it's about the bailout calculations on CCRs. It's about exit speeds and gas management with DPVs. A lot of this technology that has been around for a while now. It's almost commonplace. I mean, I would be willing to bet that 20% of the people in this room dive a rebreather as their primary method of technical and cave diving. The number of people I see at Jenny Springs with scooters continues to go up. So these are all factors I think we need to look at. And, you know, it's interesting, a lot of people look at exploration type dives and extreme dives as, you know, being more on the edge. And I'm not sure how many of you guys remember Dan Lenz. He passed away, unfortunately, a few years ago, but he told me something that always stuck, which was that the more complicated his dives got, the more conservative he got, not the opposite way around. And that when he finished a large exploration dive, if he felt he screwed up, if he had less than half the gas in his cylinders remaining. I don't think this is common, but blatant gas management rules being ignored, I hate to say it, but it's a real thing. But as far as air goes, I think that's kind of where we're at now when we look at accident analysis. Now, moving on to gas planning, again, because technology's changed, I still kind of look at gas planning and gas choices being under the air piece. But with CCRs, that also means PO2s, knowing your PO2s, monitoring your PO2s. So while traditionally we looked at gas switches and the wrong gas being breathed at the wrong depth, which unfortunately still happens today and recently, you also now have the potential in that rebreather to basically be having the exact same thing occur. You're breathing an inappropriate gas given your depth and in some cases your duration. So again, while technology's changed a little bit, I think we need to recognize that, and when we look at accident analysis, ask ourselves what we can do to try to mitigate these types of issues, because in many cases, it's not about necessarily fixing the problem by itself. It's about how can we set ourselves up so that that problem doesn't even become encountered by the diver or the dive to begin with. In some ways, I guess the best way to put it is, how do we remove that human factor and set ourselves up for success? Proper marking and analysis. I put it up there, guys. Refusal to mark tanks and analyze. I watched an instructor a few years ago walk out of my shop and practically have to yell at their student to get back inside and analyze the cylinders. And the student heard them. He was an experienced technical diver, actually out of Europe. I still remember this to this day. And good on the instructor because they didn't let it slide. But with as much technical diving as is being done in this area, we can't afford to be sloppy. The higher you get in the food chain, and as cave divers and Trimix divers, you are at the top of the food chain, the more stringently you need to adhere to things like this. There's so much going on in the water. Right, depth. I mean, this is still, we talked about depth being a significant contributing factor to accident analysis when it comes to training cave divers, and for these reasons. I mean, look, in my opinion, time is the biggest thing. The gas goes faster. So as a result, when things start to be problematic and things start to spiral, you just have less time to fix the issue, regardless of whether you're on an open circuit dive and you're in a silt out, or you're on a CCR and you just had to bail out. Narcosis, I really look at this, we're so adamant about no alcohol with diving, as we should be. If you were to crack a beer and try to jump on a molasses reef in 25 feet of water, every single decent boat captain in the Keys would tell you no, and they probably would ban you from their boat. So why do we still have deep air being taught, especially in the overhead? Water breathing, the exertion, the CO2, I think this is something that more and more the community is recognizing. If you look at some of the dive planning software like Multi-Deco, a few years ago, the gas density was never talked about. Now it's something that's calculated automatically for the diver when they plug in their gases to those types of software programs. And this last one is just kind of a little pet peeve of mine, 218 MOD. I see this a lot on CCR divers in particular. The 218, well, for those of you that don't know what I'm talking about, 218 is a 1.6 PO2 of air. Are you comfortable going to 218 feet on air? And to be clear, on the worst dive of your life? Because in most cases, if you just had to bail out and go to that gas, it is the worst dive of your life.
Well, it's worse than that because they were on 1070 and then they have an issue. They have to get off their rebreather and they're bailing out to air. So if anybody's ever gone from trimix to air at depth, bam. It's not a good point.
So I think we pretty much got past this one. I mean, look, there's just look at the prizes given away. Look at the lights on the tables. I mean, high quality dive lights, they're not hard to get. They're so much more reliable. Even when I started diving, and I've been diving as long as half the people in this room, they're active instructors. But it's something that I think we need to realize we don't need to get complacent about. And glow stick at the lips, I've seen that twice in the past 3 years. So I think that's something that we still need to look at and not remove when we look at accident analysis. But I would say, hey, good on the community in general. I think this is one of the things that we have pretty much overcome at this point. Team diving. If you look and you really want to do a true accident analysis, a lot of recent accidents have been solo. Not all of them, but a lot of them. And I think it's an example of something that is not a direct cause of the accident by any means, do not get me wrong, but it's an example of something where we have to ask ourselves, would a competent team member have made a difference? Would a competent team member have seen that a diver was about to go to an inappropriate gas and prevented the oxygen toxicity issue? And again, don't get me wrong, as I said, competent team member. Gas switches, missed transitions. In most cases, what we're hoping for is that 2 or 3 divers will not all make the same mistake. So when people talk about being independent, there is a certain amount of independence. You need to be able to take care of yourself, but you also need to be able to be a good buddy. And so if a team member misses something like a tee or a jump, I'm hoping that the other team members will notice that and they won't play follow the leader and they'll prevent a negative outcome. So, I think there is a certain amount of human nature too. I hate to say it, but I mean, if we want to talk about, again, accident analysis and that human factor, as Gareth talks about a lot of people will push limits and do things that, well, maybe if they had somebody sitting next to them, they wouldn't have done. It doesn't make it right necessarily, but it's the case. And mistakes happen. Look, I mean, I don't think that anybody intentionally points a pistol at their foot and pulls the trigger to see what it's like to get shot in the foot. But it happens all the time. It's a legitimate accident. And it's the same thing as a diver accidentally switching to oxygen at 100 feet. It's the same thing as a diver not realizing that they missed that jump or that tee. So why do people continue to break the rules? And let's be honest, these aren't rules that I'm making up, that Charlie's making up. These are things that are in the CDS workbooks for the most part. And I have to, and these are questions, these are not necessarily statements, but I mean, is it ego? Is it because, well, I'm at this level, this can't happen to me? And I personally think that's a lot of it. Is it false confidence? I mean, I think that those of us that teach are, in most cases, most nervous about our students the day after class, when they're staying in the area and they're going for their first dive post-class. And we have to believe that we gave them proper training, that they're going to do the right thing. But when you look at most of the accidents that are occurring, it's not the diver day 1 or day 2 after class. I would hope that a diver would be most safe directly after training. In most cases, it's people that are just getting enough confidence that they forget the things that were drilled into them, but more importantly, they forget the reasons that they were told certain things. And I think lack of exposure to real world accidents. So is accident analysis dead? I'll be honest, I don't see new things per se coming out of accidents very often, but what I think we sometimes twist that as is, it's not so much that it's new ways to do stupid stuff underwater, it's that divers that don't see these accidents and see these incidents routinely forget the rules, forget the real world examples, and that goes back to what I've been told at least, with Sheck's idea when he put those down in his blueprint for survival. To use not necessarily names and exact scenarios, but to use real world examples as to why we do certain things. And it always hits a little closer to home and makes a bigger impact when people can put a name and a date to a scenario. This guy did this on this date, and this is why I'm not going to do the same thing. So I think that's where Charlie and I are definitely on the same page with revamping accident analysis, is I think it needs to be done a little more publicly. Not that we're not necessarily going to see the same types of things as we did 30 years ago, but we need to remind ourselves and the community as to why these rules got put down in the first place, and then most importantly, how we can avoid them. And again, just because somebody breaks a rule or even 2 or 3 rules, it doesn't mean the outcome is going to be negative, but we need to recognize that the more of those rules that we do break, the higher the odds of a negative outcome occurring are going to be. And look, you do something 100 times, the odds are sooner or later, it's not going to work out for you. And so that's kind of how I look at that. You know, I don't gamble. I mean, maybe $1, $1 pool, playing poker with friends and stuff like that. But there's a reason Vegas makes so much money, is that people stay at the table long enough. They may be lucky for a while, but sooner or later, their luck's going to run out.
So there's been a lot written about this, breaking the rules and getting away with breaking the rules. And a lot of talk is about a new whatever, a new pilot, a new diver, anybody that participates in a risky or extreme activity. And a lot of instructors feel that the most dangerous thing that can happen is those new pilots or those new divers not make mistakes early on. Because what it does is it gives them a false sense of confidence. and they believe that they've got this thing licked. And they do more and more and more until a mistake happens far back in a cave or in some other scenario that they cannot recover from. So most instructors in risky activities believe that early failure can be a good thing. Mistakes made near the front of the cave with buddies that can point out those mistakes, with other mentors. So we're not trying to reinvent the wheel here. Accident analysis and everything that Sheck laid out is excellent, and it has become the foundation of our cave training. And we're not proposing that we get rid of that. What we're proposing is that we modernize it some. If you notice when John was going through these 5 tenets, well, some of these things didn't really fit perfectly. They were sort of shoehorned in. Perfect example is breathing the wrong gas. You know, when Sheck laid out these tenets of accident analysis, they were breathing air. And he pointed out the dangers of depth and narcosis, and we've learned from that, and we've moved to nitrox and trimix and other gases, decompression gases. But in some ways, we've traded one risk factor for another. We've traded away that narcosis or those decompression issues for additional complexities, such as other gases that can do a lot of harm if we breathe them at the wrong depth. So that's a perfect example of one that does not quite fit in perfectly to the existing 5 tenets. And I know there's a lot of instructors out there, and you'll say, oh, well, the way I teach it, you know, we fit it in, and I'm sure you do. I'm sure you put it into depth, or you talk about CCR PPO2s, and you fit it into those lectures. But the point is, we can't give up on accident analysis. We can't it's not a static thing. It can't just be the lessons that were learned 30, 40 years ago. We need to continue to improve, and we need to look at other industries. And I know there's been a lot of talk about this online, and one of the industries that we need to look at is the medical industry. Medical industry, Doug will tell you, learned a couple decades ago that transparency is essential. They learned that a full and timely disclosure to families about medical errors actually decrease litigation. And we're not really faced with that so much, but it certainly is an aspect. And the outcomes, in the medical industry, outcomes are tracked, and they often are even tied to funding, federal funding to hospitals and to medical centers. So the point is tracking these trends allows hospitals to improve their outcomes. And they don't stop and say, oh, we've learned all we need to learn about that. It's a continuing process. Another industry that we need to learn from and look at is the aviation industry. Aviation industry does the best job of a detailed accident investigation reporting. I know a lot of you probably, maybe not a lot of you, but some of you are pilots and know about this. The aviation industry actually, for some incidents, they have mandatory reporting. So they always have a voluntary, like if you see something that's dangerous, you can report it voluntarily. But if certain things happen, it's a mandatory reporting. And they look at all of it and track it. They have this pretty elaborate reporting system. In fact, NASA looks at that information as a kind of a third party. The focus is on improving aviation safety. And it's a moving target. They always want to continue to improve. The object is to put themselves out of business, which obviously is never going to happen. There's always going to be mistakes. They identify causes, whether those causes are mechanical, pilot error, perhaps training, perhaps cultural. And all these important causations are teased out, and they've saved lives. They've recognized that there are cultural differences in certain countries where you have a power differences between the captain and the co-pilot, the pilot and the co-pilot. And we know this, and training has been changed to change those outcomes so the co-pilot actually has a voice in the cockpit, for example. So what's the current state of accident analysis in cave diving? Well, this is the part that some people are upset about. It's inconsistent to non-existent. Really, in the last 20 to 30 years, we've had very inconsistent and at some points non-existent accident analysis. And there's a number of reasons for that, and I don't want to get into the blame game. There's no reason for that. What I want to do is I want to move forward as a community, and I want us all to work together to fix this problem. So we're still working off the 40-year-old lessons that Sheck taught us that are largely based on air diving, a set of 104s and thirds. As I said, these new causations are shoehorned in to these traditional 5. And a perfect example is breathing the wrong gas. So why do we need to change? Well, as I said before, accident analysis is the foundation for all our training. So we've got a lot of training going on, a lot of new people coming into the sport. I mean, this is the biggest CDS convention as far as attendance in a long, long time. So that just shows you the sport is getting more and more popular. I'm actually very optimistic because I see a lot of young people coming into the sport, which is a great thing. So it tells me that cave diving is going to be around and continue to grow. But we need to grow with it. We cannot keep teaching lessons from 30 years ago. And don't get me wrong, I'm not saying those lessons are necessarily wrong. We don't need to throw out Sheck's lessons. We need to modernize them and add to them. For example, the lights. You know, we don't need to, just because everybody's carrying 3 lights now doesn't mean we need to stop teaching that. Of course we should continue to teach that. But we won that battle, and now we need to refocus our efforts. So there's really been a lack of accident analysis and trend analysis. Trend analysis is an important part of that. Somebody with a database looking at how are these accidents happening? What are the trends? Are they all solo? Are a lot of them solo? Are they all breathing the wrong gas? Are they all CCR related? Frankly, we have no idea at this point, and we need to change that. Unfortunately, the lack of accident analysis and trend analysis correlates very strongly with these huge changes we've seen in cave diving. How many of you are diving just open circuit 104s now? No, I guarantee you, only swimming. Guarantee you a lot of you are on DPBs, a lot of you are on CCRs, a lot of you are side mount. So these technologies have really changed the face of the sport. And we need to have modern analysis to know what's happening, essentially. So, as of today, I'm happy to announce that the CDS is going to step in and we're going to reestablish an accident analysis committee. So a couple of things we want to accomplish. We want to separate the analysis from the recovery team. We want to keep it as a separate group, and if for some reason one of the divers in that group did participate in recovery, they would recuse themselves. We want to keep it separate, non-biased. Recovery divers have a hard enough job with what they're doing already. We want to do an annual report at the conference, so I'm hoping that we can continue having an annual conference, no more COVID. And we're going to report our findings, and we're going to report them in writing. We're going to have a written accident analysis. Now, we can only control what we can control, and part of this accident analysis is going to require information. And we are going to work with and do whatever we can to facilitate the flow of information from the recovery teams to our group so that we have the information, the facts, so that we can do an effective accident analysis. And we'll work with them in whatever we need to do. Now, for some reason, we can't get the information from, maybe there's an accident somewhere else, not here in Florida or something, that we're still going to try to do an accident analysis, and we're going to weight that information, give it the appropriate weight based on the information we get. Okay, and that will be divulged. If it's third-hand information, we'll say so. But we're hoping that we can get direct and factual information directly from the recovery divers. And there's some changes that are being made that make me hopeful that that will happen. The other thing we're going to do is we're going to submit these reports to the NSS Journal, American Caving Accidents. That's been done in the past, and we're going to continue with that. So everyone that we do an analysis of is going to be submitted and published in the annual journal, NSS American Caving Accidents. So who's going to do this? I'm going to lead this up. My name's Charlie Roberson. I told you that before. I am a lawyer by trade and a former lawyer. I run a dive business now, but I have some experience in that type of critical analysis. Doug Ebersol has agreed to be part of this committee. Happy to have Doug on board. He's a hyperbaric. He's a physician that has. Are you a hyperbaric physician?
Well, I'm a cardiologist. I'm trained in hyperbaric.
You are trained in hyperbaric. I know he's got a lot of knowledge in hyperbaric medicine, and that's what's important. We felt it was essential that we had a physician on this committee that can look at medical terminology and look at incidents and accidents from a medical perspective. We also believed that we really needed a seasoned instructor, and Lamar Hires has agreed to participate in this committee, and Lamar is going to bring a lot to the table. Not only his experience teaching over, how long has it been, Lamar? 30 years? You've been teaching? 40? 20 years? About 40, don't want to say, fair enough. But also Lamar has been very involved in the recovery, the IUCRR, and Lamar is going to be essential in helping facilitating that flow of information. And I know there's some changes that are happening in the IUCRR, and that all gives me hope that we can all work together and really do what we need to do to document these accidents and learn from them. So when do you do that?
So we do pilot training about once a month, and also we have a anonymous reporting system where after every flight, we have someone that's either relatively unsafe, we're going to report that up on like a 30 safety officer, and that's reported up in there. So this is a daily occurrence for us, and then we talk about it, like in group setting in person on the conference report. And that's this type of reports, that's action reports. So we do that daily.
You know, I know that a lot of special forces operators do something similar. They have, you know, a sit down after each operation, training exercise, whatever, and they check their egos at the door and they tell everybody what they did wrong and what everybody else did wrong. And, you know, maybe we do need more of that. Maybe we need more of that post-dive, heart-to-heart with our buddies.
Yeah, so that was actually my question, I guess, for you and for the room. How do we change the culture to where we know, of course, when the medical industry is good and the aviation industry is good, really bring that to cave diving so that the reporting system that I was kind of mentioned for general aviation, for military aviation, becomes the normal? Like, how do we do that?
It's a good question, and I don't have the answer to that. I think this is one step towards that. You know, this is, the reality is the cave diving is a sport, and we all come together not because we're getting paid or because we're working for a single organization, or we're doing it for fun. And it's hard to create those type of rules and structures around something that's essentially a hobby for most of us. So I think it's an uphill battle, but I think we do what we can, and I think this is part of it, getting that information out there and letting the training agencies, I mean, let's be honest, not all training agencies are cut from the same cloth. I think we all recognize that. Some of the training agencies are much more stringent and have more stringent oversight.
You guys intending on doing any retroactive analysis to look at accidents in the past 10 years?
So yes, I don't know how far back we're going to be able to go, but we probably will go back a few years. Certainly don't want to try to capture everything that's happened this year and perhaps from last year. At some point, there just won't be time to get all of that. I don't know that we can go back 10 years. You know, maybe if we get lucky and there's no more accidents and we have time, we can address those, but, you know, mostly this is going to be going forward. Yes? Yes?
Is familiar with more than enough Texas, sorry. But that in medicine, I think that's the one thing we didn't go easy into that. We were told for years and years and years, you got to report health, you got to breathe, until we made standard checklists, we didn't do it well. I think we do it pretty well now. We follow aviation pre-and checklists. Having, what you have to report, near misses, what's connected. Not complicated, but simply checklist as possible.
Sure. This kind of goes back to what he was talking about in the, military community, and my answer to that is, this is a sport. We're not all getting paid to do this, and we're not doing it. We're not going to get fired if we don't report. This is a hobby, so we can encourage it. I'm all up for suggestions on how we increase that, but it's a bit of an uphill battle. Yes?
I think doing a bit of a trickle-down approach might be an effective way to start the ball rolling. When I used to teach regular open water divers, the once-a-year diver, the diver who hadn't been in the water for 5 years, those are the scariest people around. And a habit I got into in making sure all of my divers knew, you can come on back to me and audit a class, we'll go in the pool, we'll go over what you need. If you really need training, we can do an abbreviated course, and there would be a charge, but yes, let's put you back in an environment where we can look at what you remember, what you do, and whether or not you're saving the water. When I was teaching age, I used to emphasize a similar. You know, you couldn't have the odd man out come in and throw the numbers off on an entire course, but they could certainly come, audit, listen to the lectures, and regain the confidence that they should have. The best way, I think, to make all of this happen is to start with the training agency. Now, we can't affect what the other agencies do, at least not to a significant amount, but the CDS was initially established to be a premier aid training organization. And we've let that position slide over the last 10, 15 years. We are no longer considered the premier organization. But I think if we go in and start looking at and adding to the training, the type of, in fact, an accident analysis, I'm going to jump around a little bit, but I think there is time for at least 1/6 factor beyond the original 5. And that is, are you currently competent, currently experienced, or are you somebody who's been out of water for the last 8 years, but you think you can come back in and do the same guy you did 8 years ago?
No, I agree completely. I mean, you know, Sheck talked about training as you know, a binary thing. Either you're trained or you're not. I think a lot of the training that's happening, I know John is teaching it, it's really more of are you trained for the dive that you're doing? Are you not only just having a card, but are you physically, mentally, all of it ready for the dive? I know that's how I've heard him teach it, and I've seen others teach it that way. No, I agree completely. Anybody else? Yes.